So, around the year 610, there was this man named Muhammad, a respected merchant from Mecca, who often sought solitude in the quiet rocky confines of the cave of Hira. It was a place he'd go to for meditation and reflection. But during one of these retreats, his life was changed forever by a really profound and honestly terrifying experience. According to Islamic tradition, an angelic being, later identified as Gabriel, suddenly appeared before him. The presence seized him and commanded him to read. Muhammad, who, by the way, was illiterate, protested that he couldn't. But the being squeezed him with immense force, almost to the point of suffocation, and repeated the command. This actually happened 3 times, until finally, words began to flow from Muhammad's lips, words that would become the very first verses of the Quran. The encounter left Muhammad deeply shaken and in a state of extreme fear. He didn't feel enlightened or chosen. Instead, he was convinced that he'd been possessed by a jinn or a demon. He fled down the mountain trembling and rushed home to his wife, Khadija. He cried out, cover me, just seeking comfort and refuge from this overwhelming experience that had just happened to him. He explained everything, expressing his grave concern for his own sanity and fearing that a malevolent spirit had taken hold of him. Khadija, who was a wise and respected woman, listened patiently and offered reassurance, becoming the first person to believe in his divine mission. In the days that followed, Muhammad's distress didn't just go away. Some early historical accounts, like those by the historian Al-Tabari, describe a period of intense despair. He was so troubled by what had happened that he reportedly even contemplated ending his own life. And according to these narratives, whenever he would approach the edge of a cliff, the same being would reappear, stopping him by declaring, "O Muhammad, you are the apostle of God, and I am Gabriel." This repeated intervention slowly convinced Muhammad of the divine origin of his encounters, transforming his initial terror into a kind of reluctant acceptance of his role as a messenger for God. This first revelation marks the beginning of Islam, but honestly, the nature of the experience is a crucial point of discussion. From a Muslim perspective, Muhammad's fear and self-doubt are seen as signs of his genuine humility and sincerity. They'd say that a charlatan would likely invent a story of a glorious and empowering vision, not one filled with terror and confusion. But, from a critical or non-religious viewpoint, this intense psychological distress, including the reported suicidal thoughts, could be interpreted differently. Skeptics might suggest it points to a psychological event, maybe a hallucination brought on by stress or other factors, rather than a divine encounter. Still, the raw human reaction of fear is a central element of the story. Long before the revelations in the cave, stories of unusual events were already associated with Muhammad's early life, hinting that a special destiny awaited him. One of the most famous of these accounts comes from his time as a young boy living with a Bedouin tribe, which was actually a common practice for noble Meccan families. He was in the care of his wet nurse, Halima. According to the biography written by Ibn Ishaq, one day while Muhammad was playing with his foster brother, 2 men dressed in brilliant white garments appeared. This event, known as the opening of the chest, is a cornerstone of his hagiography, pointing to a divine preparation for his future role as a prophet. The 2 men reportedly laid the young Muhammad down, opened his chest, and took out his heart. From his heart, they removed a small black clot, which they described as the part of Satan that exists in every person. Then they washed his heart with pure snow in a golden basin, before carefully placing it back into his chest, and healing the opening without leaving a scar. Muhammad's foster brother ran back to their tent, shouting that Muhammad had been killed. Halima and her husband rushed out to find Muhammad pale, but unharmed, with no sign of the incredible spiritual surgery that had just taken place. This miraculous event, though, wasn't met with immediate understanding or joy by his caretakers. Halima was struck with immense fear. She and her husband worried that the boy had been possessed by a demon or had become the target of some supernatural harm. The fear was so great that they felt they could no longer be responsible for his safety. Believing it was best for him to be with his own family, they made the difficult decision to end their fosterage arrangement. They promptly returned the young Muhammad to his mother, Amina, in Mecca, explaining the strange and frightening incident that had prompted their decision. From a Muslim theological perspective, this story is seen as a clear and early sign of Muhammad's prophethood. It symbolizes his purification by God, preparing him from a young age to be a pure vessel for the divine message of the Quran. It sets him apart from all other humans by showing that God had personally cleansed him of satanic influence. For critics and historians, however, the story is a bit more complicated. They note that such hagiographic tales are common in the foundational stories of many religions, serving to elevate the founder's status. And, lacking external corroboration, these accounts are often viewed as legendary embellishments added by later followers to affirm their leader's divine authority. One of the most debated and controversial episodes in Muhammad's life is the incident commonly known as the Satanic verses. This event reportedly took place around the year 615, during a time when the small Muslim community faced intense persecution from the powerful Quraysh tribe of Mecca. The Quraysh were polytheists who worshipped many gods and goddesses at the Kaaba, and they saw Muhammad's strict monotheism as a direct threat to their traditions, economy, and social structure. In a moment that seemed to promise a temporary peace, Muhammad was reciting a portion of the Quran, what is now known as Surah 53, the Star, in the presence of both his followers and his opponents. As he recited the verses, he came to the part that speaks of the pagan goddesses, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, three deities highly revered by the Quraysh. According to early biographers like Al-Tabari and Ibn Sa'd, Muhammad uttered the words, "These are the exalted Quranic, whose intercession is approved." The term Quranic is thought to refer to high-soaring birds, and the phrase basically endorsed the idea that these goddesses could act as intercessors with a higher god. When the Quraysh leaders heard this, they were overjoyed. They saw it as a concession, a bridge between their polytheistic beliefs and Muhammad's monotheism. In a remarkable moment of unity, they even prostrated in worship alongside the Muslims. The peace, though, was short-lived. Later, the angel Gabriel supposedly came to Muhammad and rebuked him, making it clear that those conciliatory words were not from God. Gabriel stated that Satan had cast those verses onto Muhammad's tongue, exploiting his deep desire to win over his people and end the persecution. Distraught, Muhammad retracted the verses. He admitted, according to Al-Tabari, "I have fabricated things against God, and have imputed to him words which he has not spoken." The retraction shattered the brief truce immediately. The persecution of the Muslims by the Quraysh not only resumed but even intensified, as they now saw Muhammad as someone who would say anything and could not be trusted. The significance of this incident is pretty profound and is interpreted in vastly different ways. Most modern Muslim scholars reject the story's authenticity, arguing it was fabricated by enemies of Islam or is based on unreliable historical chains. They contend that it's just inconceivable for a prophet to be deceived by Satan in transmitting revelation. However, some classical scholars did accept it, pointing to a verse in the Quran, Surah 22, verse 52, which states that Satan can cast suggestions into the desires of every prophet, but that Allah ultimately cancels out these suggestions. For critics of Islam, the incident is seen as evidence that Muhammad was not a true prophet, but rather a fallible man, who at best confused his own desires with divine revelation or at worst deliberately compromised his message for political gain. When evaluating the claims of any prophet, a lot of people, especially those from Judeo-Christian backgrounds, turn to the tests for prophecy outlined in the Bible. The book of Deuteronomy is super central to this whole discussion. Muslim apologists often point to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, where God tells Moses, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth." Muslims argue this is a prophecy of Muhammad, who, like Moses, was a lawgiver, a leader, and a mortal man. They believe he came from the fellow Israelites, which they interpret as their cousins, the Arabs descended from Ishmael, and that he spoke the words God put in his mouth, the Quran. However, critics are quick to point out the verses that come right after this passage, which set up some pretty strict criteria for identifying a false prophet. Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 20 gives a stark warning. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. This verse lays out two clear tests. First, a prophet must never deliver a message that God has not commanded, and second, they must never speak in the name of other deities. From a critical Christian perspective, the Satanic verses incident directly violates both of these conditions, whether the verses were a mistake or a satanic deception. The argument from this viewpoint is pretty straightforward. By uttering words that praised the pagan goddesses Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat as intercessors, Muhammad was, even if just for a moment, speaking in the name of other gods. And by his own reported admission after the retraction, he had spoken words that God had not commanded him to speak. According to the standard laid out in Deuteronomy, this would disqualify him as a true prophet of the God of Abraham. This biblical test is seen as absolute and uncompromising, allowing no room for error, deception, or even temporary satanic influence in the relaying of God's direct word, which must remain pure and unaltered. Muslim scholars, of course, offer a strong defense against this interpretation. First, the majority reject the historicity of the Satanic verses incident altogether, making the entire criticism moot in their eyes. For those who do accept it, they argue that the biblical test doesn't actually apply to Muhammad, since he was the seal of a new and final prophetic tradition. They also point to the Quranic explanation in Surah 22, verse 52, which frames such an event not as a failure of the prophet, but as a trial from God, who always corrects the message and solidifies his truth. This verse suggests that satanic interference is a known possibility for all prophets, but that God's power ensures the final revelation remains pure, a viewpoint that, honestly, fundamentally clashes with the strict Deuteronomic criteria. So, a key measure of a prophet's authenticity, found in both the Bible and the Quran, is the ability to make accurate predictions about the future. Muhammad is attributed with several prophecies, and honestly, the fulfillment of these is a source of great faith for Muslims. One of the most frequently cited examples is found in Surah 30 of the Quran, which talks about the ongoing war between the Byzantine, or Roman and Persian empires. The verses prophesied that the Byzantines, who had just suffered a devastating defeat, would be victorious within a few years. The Arabic phrase used is generally understood to mean a period of 3 to 9 years. Now history confirms that the Byzantines did indeed rally and achieve a final decisive victory over the Persians. For Muslims, this is seen as a clear miracle of the Quran, predicting a major geopolitical shift that honestly seemed highly improbable at the time. However, critics do scrutinize the timeline pretty closely. The final Byzantine victory is generally dated to around 628 or 629 CE, which was about 13 to 16 years after the prophecy was believed to have been revealed. So, this actually falls outside the 3 to 9 year window specified by the text. Apologists, on the other hand, argue that the Arabic term can be interpreted more broadly, or that the victory referred to an earlier, less decisive battle that did fall within the time frame. Another significant prophecy is found in the Hadith, which are the collections of Muhammad's sayings and actions. One Hadith, recorded by Abu Dawood, states that a Muslim conquest of Constantinople would occur, and that the appearance of the Dajjal, the Islamic Antichrist figure, would follow shortly thereafter. The historical part of this prophecy was fulfilled when the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, conquered Constantinople in 1453. This event was a monumental victory for the Muslim world. However, the second part of the prophecy remains unfulfilled. More than 570 years have passed since the city's conquest, and the Dajjal has not appeared, leading critics to label this as a failed prophecy. These examples really highlight the complex nature of interpreting prophetic claims. Believers often see fulfillments that affirm their faith, while skeptics focus on ambiguities, unmet conditions, or timelines that just don't precisely align. The prophecies attributed to Muhammad are no exception to this pattern. For followers, the prediction of a Byzantine victory or the eventual conquest of major cities serves as powerful proof of his divine knowledge. For non-believers, the discrepancies in timing or the unfulfilled elements are seen as evidence that the predictions were either vague enough to be retrofitted to events or were simply incorrect, which calls into question the divine source of the information. The Quran contains many stories about figures who are also prominent in the Bible, such as Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, as well as other narratives and parables. A central claim of Islam is that the Quran is the direct, uncreated word of God, revealed to Muhammad. However, critics and academics have long explored the possibility of external influences on its content, suggesting that some stories were derived from pre-existing texts and oral traditions circulating in the Arabian Peninsula during the 7th century. This has led to accusations of plagiarism, which were even voiced by Muhammad's contemporaries in Mecca. One of the most cited examples is the story of Jesus creating a bird from clay and breathing life into it, as mentioned in Surah 3, verse 49 of the Quran. This miracle does not appear in the canonical Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, a very similar story is found in a 2nd century apocryphal text known as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Scholars suggest that Muhammad, an illiterate but well-traveled merchant, may have heard this popular story from Christian communities, such as a delegation from Najran he is known to have met, and later incorporated it into his revelations, believing it to be a true part of Jesus' life. The Quran itself acknowledges that Muhammad faced accusations of borrowing his material. His opponents in Mecca are quoted as saying the Quran was nothing more than fables of the ancients, which he has caused to be written down. That's from Surah 25 verse 5. They claimed he was being taught by others. Islamic historical sources mention several individuals with whom Muhammad had significant contact who could have been sources of religious knowledge. These include Waraka ibn Nawfal, his wife Khadija's Christian cousin, a Christian slave known as Jabir, and the various Jewish rabbis he interacted with extensively after his migration to Medina. Critics argue these interactions provided him with the raw material for many Quranic narratives. Muslim scholars counter these claims by reaffirming their belief in the divine origin of the Quran. They argue that similarities between the Quran and earlier texts do not prove plagiarism, but rather demonstrate a shared, divine source. From this perspective, God revealed truths to earlier prophets, like Moses and Jesus, but their messages were corrupted or lost over time. The Quran, therefore, serves as a final and perfect revelation that corrects the errors in previous scriptures and restores the original, pure monotheistic faith. The story of the clay bird, they would argue, may have been a true event that was preserved in apocryphal literature and then confirmed by the final, authoritative revelation of the Quran. A particularly challenging episode for both believers and critics is the account of Muhammad being bewitched. This event is recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari, one of the most trusted and authoritative collections of hadith in Sunni Islam. According to the narrative, a Jewish man from Medina named Labid ibn al-As'am cast a powerful spell on Muhammad. The magic was performed using a comb, some of Muhammad's hair that was stuck in it, and a cord with 11 knots, which was then hidden in a well. The effects of this bewitchment were profound and lasted for a significant period, with some reports suggesting up to a year. The spell caused Muhammad to suffer from severe confusion and disorientation. The hadith states that he would imagine he had done things that he had not, most notably believing he had been intimate with his wives when he had not. This created a state where he could not reliably distinguish between reality and illusion. The ordeal finally ended after Muhammad had a dream in which 2 angels revealed the nature of the spell and the location of the magical items. His companions retrieved the knotted cord from the well, and as each of the 11 knots was untied, The effects of the spell gradually lifted until he was fully recovered. This account raises difficult theological questions, especially concerning the concept of prophetic infallibility, or, for Muslims, a prophet is divinely protected from major sin and error, especially in the transmission of revelation. The idea that Muhammad could be so profoundly affected by black magic, to the point of losing his grip on reality, seems to contradict this protection. It opens the door for critics to ask, if he was so susceptible to a magic spell, how can one be certain that his revelations during this period were not also affected? Could his confusion have extended to the divine messages he was receiving? Muslim scholars have grappled with this issue for centuries. The majority accept the hadith as authentic, but interpret its implications carefully. They argue that the bewitchment affected only Muhammad's worldly affairs and his physical body, not his prophetic mission or the integrity of the Quranic revelation. They maintain that God protected the divine message itself, even while allowing the prophet to suffer as a human being. On the other hand, critics of Islam point to this incident as a significant vulnerability. They argue that a true prophet of an all-powerful God would not be susceptible to the magic of a mere mortal, and that this episode casts serious doubt on the reliability of any of his claims. The life and teachings of Muhammad are viewed through a variety of lenses, resulting in deeply divergent interpretations of his character and mission. For nearly 2 billion Muslims, he is Rasul Allah, the messenger of God, and the final and most important prophet in a long line that includes Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. His life is seen as the perfect example for all humanity to follow. From this perspective, the challenges he faced, the terrifying first revelation, the persecution, the Satanic verses incident, and his bewitchment, are not signs of weakness, but are instead trials that demonstrate his humanity, his perseverance, and God's ultimate protection over the divine message he was chosen to deliver. The Muslim perspective emphasizes Muhammad's sincerity and the transformative impact of his message. They point to the radical social, spiritual, and political changes he brought to 7th century Arabia, uniting warring tribes under the banner of monotheism, establishing laws for justice and charity, and elevating the status of the poor and marginalized. The stories of miracles from his childhood are seen as divine markers of his special destiny. The rapid spread of Islam and the enduring power of the Quran are considered the ultimate proof of his prophethood. For believers, any perceived inconsistencies or difficult episodes are resolved through faith in God's wisdom and the context provided by Islamic theology. From a traditional Christian viewpoint, Muhammad cannot be a true prophet in the same vein as the biblical prophets, because his message contradicts core Christian doctrines, particularly the divinity of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion. The Quran honors Jesus as a great prophet, but denies that he is the Son of God or that he was crucified. For many Christians, the biblical tests of prophecy, especially the strictures in Deuteronomy against speaking for other gods or delivering a message not from God, are paramount. The Satanic verses incident, if accepted as historical, is seen as a clear failure of this test. Muhammad is therefore often viewed as either a sincerely mistaken man who was deceived by a spiritual power or as a deliberate fabricator. A non-religious or secular academic perspective approaches Muhammad as a historical figure, setting aside questions of divine intervention. Historians analyze the social, economic, and political conditions of 7th century Arabia to understand the rise of Islam. From this viewpoint, Muhammad was a brilliant and charismatic leader who responded to a spiritual and social vacuum in his society. The Quran is studied as a literary and historical document, with scholars tracing its potential influences from Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian traditions. Events like the bewitchment or the initial revelation are often analyzed through a psychological or anthropological lens, as human experiences rather than supernatural encounters, without passing judgment on their ultimate truth. The question of whether Muhammad was a true prophet of God or something else entirely remains one of the most significant and divisive questions in religious history. The reasons people arrive at their conclusions are deeply rooted in their worldview, their interpretation of historical events, and their personal faith. For those who accept his prophethood, the evidence is compelling and multifaceted. They see a man who, despite being illiterate, produced the Quran, a book of profound literary beauty and spiritual depth that has guided billions of lives. They see a leader who transformed a fractured and violent society into a unified and powerful civilization. Believers argue that Muhammad's personal character, his honesty, humility, and compassion, is inconsistent with that of a deceiver. His initial fear and self-doubt upon receiving the first revelation are seen as proof of his sincerity, not as signs of a fabrication. The fulfillment of prophecies, such as the Byzantine victory over the Persians, and the sheer endurance and global spread of the Islamic faith, are considered undeniable miracles that validate his divine mission. For a devout Muslim, the pieces of Muhammad's life fit together to form a perfect picture of a man chosen by God to deliver the final message to humanity, a message that is both a continuation and a correction of earlier revelations. Conversely, those who reject Muhammad's prophethood build their case on a foundation of critical analysis and perceived inconsistencies. They point to the Satanic verses incident as a moment where the message was compromised, and to the bewitchment as evidence of a vulnerability unbecoming of a divinely protected messenger. Skeptics highlight the unfulfilled aspects of his prophecies, such as the delayed appearance of the Dajjal after the conquest of Constantinople. They also focus on the similarities between Quranic stories and pre-existing apocryphal and rabbinic literature, suggesting a human origin for what is claimed to be a divine text. For these critics, Muhammad may have been a sincere man who misinterpreted his own intense spiritual or psychological experiences. Others may view him as a gifted political and social reformer who used the language of divine revelation to achieve his goals of uniting the Arab tribes. The question of whether he was a true prophet, a well-intentioned but mistaken mystic, or a deliberate fabricator, depends entirely on how one weighs the historical accounts, theological arguments, and the very nature of faith itself. In the end, the truth about Muhammad remains a matter of deep personal conviction, making him either the greatest prophet in history or the architect of its biggest deception.
As a follower of Jesus, I approach these claims with a critical perspective rooted in my faith. I encourage viewers to examine the evidence and decide for themselves.